The United Nations peacekeeping mission in Mali has been called the most deadly on earth. Many soldiers have died trying to calm this West African nation that's in the grip of armed groups. And now some countries are pulling their troops out just when the violence is spreading. So what's next for Mali? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Divya Gopalan. Mali is facing war. That's the warning from President Ibrahim Boubacar Keita as the country struggles to contain what the UN calls a significant surge in violence. Now, just 10 days ago, more than 153 people died in one of the worst attacks between rival tribes. And armed groups such as ISIL and Al Qaeda are gaining strength. Just as the government is warning of turmoil, UN peacekeepers are leaving. Canada and the Netherlands are withdrawing their soldiers. Nicholas Haak has this report from one of their last missions near the city of Gao.
They call this Operation Desert Falcon. On board this Royal Canadian Air Force helicopter are the Dutch long-range reconnaissance team. They're about to be dropped close to the border with Burkina Faso in an area controlled by armed groups. While ISIL in Syria is on the defensive, here the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, the local ISIL offshoot, is on the offensive. It's highly active in this border area and has claimed a number of attacks. Too dangerous and sensitive, the UN would not allow us to film this infiltration operation, with both Canadians and Dutch forces removing some of the footage we shot to protect their troops, they say. While this is a peacekeeping mission, it looks and feels like an exercise in counterinsurgency.
What makes this mission dangerous is that we have a lot of different layers of conflict drivers that actually feed the danger in Mali, because we have a lot of smugglers, smuggling activity, illegal trafficking, criminality. We have this ethnical tension between different groups. We have the influx of terrorists from the border region and from inside Mali. And also we have this tension between the armed groups that are sort of fighting for political power. And all these things add up to one big, dangerous melting pot.
MINUSMA, as the mission in Mali is known, costs $1 billion a year and is considered the UN's most perilous. It's already cost the lives of 200 peacekeepers. That's more than any previous mission, and some of them were Dutch.
The Canadian forces have brought back their helicopter to get it refueled. Meanwhile, some 300 kilometers away, the Dutch forces continue their ground patrol. Make no mistake, this is an international effort to try to bring back peace to Mali, in a country that's spiraling out of control.
Although their mandate is to protect all of Mali, the European forces limit their operation just as far as this Canadian medevac team can carry them and bring them back. In March, the UN forces did not intervene when hundreds of Fulani villagers were attacked by government-backed militia groups in the region of Mopti. While the violence continues to spread, Canada and the Netherlands are pulling out of this operation, saying their mission is done.
We are leaving, but the UN still stays behind with another 13,000 troops. So I'm not afraid that Mali will completely collapse now that while we leave. They might lose a specific asset, but the other troops that are still around can do a job just as well.
They come back hours later, after having seen thousands of people uprooted by the increasing violence, in need of help, but in the hands of armed groups. They bear witness to what seems to be an expanding war, fought out of sight, deep in the Sahel. Nicholas Haak, Al Jazeera, Gao.
Well, Mali has been in a state of turmoil since 2012. That's when local Tuaregs, as well as Al Qaeda-linked armed groups, seized large parts of the north. A military operation led by France pushed them back the following year, and more than 15,000 UN personnel were deployed to help stabilize the country. Then in 2015, the government and Tuareg rebels signed a peace deal in the capital, Bamako. But this did not stop attacks by other armed groups. In fact, they have increased. Now, Mali is still under threat from several groups, mainly affiliated with Al Qaeda and ISIL, and the government has no control over parts of the country. We can now bring in our guest. Joining us from Paris is Marie-Roger Biloa, Chief Executive Officer for MRB Networks. In New York is Adam Day. He's the head of programs at the United Nations University's Center for Policy Research. And from London, we have Paul Melly, a consulting fellow at the Africa program at Chatham House. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for being on the program. I'd like to start with you, Adam Day, and ask you to put it in context with us. Why is MINUSMA known as the UN's most dangerous mission?
Thanks so much. I mean, for very basic reasons, it has the highest number of casualties, 195 casualties since its deployment, and it is facing asymmetric threats that don't exist really anywhere else in the UN system, although there are other challenging environments. And so it really is that immediate threat, but it also has to do with the scope of the mission. The mission is deployed over a huge area, often without the resources to necessarily cover that area with the mandate it's given. And as you see the conflict spread from the north down to the center and across the region, it's being asked to do more with the same amount of resources that it had before. So I think it's that combination of immediate threat with 100 IEDs last year alone and that spread of the mission quite thinly across a very large territory, which gives it that reputation as the most dangerous place to be in peacekeeping.
Marie-Roger Biloa, we've been saying the point of this whole discussion is the fact that international troops are pulling out. Why is it necessary for there to be international peacekeeping forces there of this extent? Why can't the government of Mali itself deal with the security situation, or African troops combat these conflicts?
Okay, first of all, the Mali government has shown its inability to deal with the question. The issue with the north of Mali has been lingering for decades, and it didn't start in 2012. It started maybe like 20 years or 30 years ago, or since even the colonization. So, the situation has been worsening over the years until we came close to the jihadis taking over the whole country, and the French troops stopped them. So it was clear that on a military point of view, the Mali government is not able to deal with it alone. Whenever this kind of situation occurs in Africa, or mostly in Africa, let's say so, there is a need, there is a feeling that people need an international force. And that's what happened after the French came to rescue Mali upon request of the Mali government. It was difficult for them to stay alone there without reminding too much of a colonial force. So they wanted to be helped or joined by some other countries, especially by the UN, under the cover of the UN. But the problem is that it appears that the issue is not only a military issue, and you cannot deal with that only with troops, as is a lot of people around there, a lot of troops, like 19,000 or 14,000 has been changing, and the results are very meager. So that's why you have countries questioning their own presence there, like Canada and now the UN, and we heard the American representative finding that there's not much progress made after the peace accords of 2015. So it's not been implemented enough.
Indeed, and that is something I would like to discuss going forward in this discussion. But let me bring in Paul Melly. Can you explain to us why it's such a complicated situation and the dynamics that are happening on the ground with the civilians and then with the troops themselves?
Well, I think we need to remember that Mali is one of the largest countries in Africa, and there are quite contrasting different regions even within the area that's affected in the north and the center. So in the far north, you have a fairly open desert landscape, and the armed groups that were active there, not so much the jihadist groups, but the Tuareg armed groups that were campaigning for autonomy, they are politically structured. So it was possible to bring them into the formal Algiers peace accord. And although it's not working terribly well, there has been progress in developing decentralized regional authorities in the 5 northern regions, and with the former separatists holding political roles in several of those authorities. So there's a structure into which you can try and move people from violence to politics. But in the center of Mali, which is much more densely inhabited and which is a very different landscape, and is much more, if you like, normal Sahelian rural West Africa, farming and pastoralist communities, there you have intercommunal conflicts, pressure on land, competition for grazing, for water, and those conflicts have been then given an extra edge, if you like, by the engagement of jihadist groups. But the actual roots of the crisis are very different from those in the far north, and the conditions are very different. And so this is a really difficult challenge, whether it's for the UN force MINUSMA or for the French force Barkhane, or indeed for the Malian national security forces, because this environment in the center of Mali is a very complicated social arena in which there isn't really the same degree of political organization able to deliver a peace accord to which, as it were, structured groups can sign up. So in the north, you still have occasional very serious terrorist attacks, but at least you have a political understanding. In the center of the country, we haven't got that far yet. We still have, as the horrible massacre a week ago showed, with more than, I think it was 135 Pearl Fulani pastoralist villagers murdered by a local militia group, a community militia group that had nothing to do with jihadism. We've got these really deep-rooted local problems, and that's a very difficult and different setting for the UN to operate in. And that's one reason why the Sahel countries are now developing their own joint regional force to operate using local troops in these more populated areas.
So in that sense, then, Mr. Day, why is it that the UN is so concerned about Canadian troops pulling out, so concerned that they took the unusual step of requesting them to extend their stay? What is the void that they're afraid of?
Well, first, I think, just to expand on Paul's point, is that the protection risks that have moved into the center of Mali really result from the vacuum in the government's ability to provide security there. And so one of the reasons that the Canadian troops are important is not necessarily the troops, but the specialized capabilities they provide. They provide a Chinook helicopter for medical evacuations. They have 4 armed helicopters. And when you've got to move around the country a lot and respond to new protection threats in new areas, that specialized capability is extremely important. Similar with the Dutch, they provide a specialized capability. Now, the UN had identified a replacement for the Canadians. The Romanian government had offered in 4 months. And what the gap is really that 4-month gap between now and October, when they won't have that specialized capability. But I think when you're talking about the risk to UN troops, largely that's borne by the African troops and not by the European ones. And I think sometimes there's a distortion when we talk about risk to different troops. When if you look at the casualty rates, it's overwhelmingly falling on the African troops and not the European ones, even though they do have some casualties. So I think there's a tendency to overemphasize that. But I think when you're talking about what the UN is concerned about losing, it's that mobility, that ability to move around to new areas that is provided by troops like the Canadians. But hopefully in October, the Romanians will replace that. And I think there's an idea that European or Western troops can have 1-year rotations that are better planned so that there aren't gaps. And that would be a good idea that would avoid the situation we're in right now, where you have a very high spike in risks to civilians in the center and a looming gap in some of the ability to respond to it.
Marie Roger Biloa, I want to pick up on a point that Mr. Day had made about the risk being for mostly African troops bearing the heavier risk. And also what is known is that the African troops are often not as well equipped as their international counterparts. Now, what kind of an issue or complication does this present for peacekeeping in Mali?
Yes, that is a very good point. You know, those who've been dying mostly among the troops are the Chadians and the Malians themselves, and let's say globally the Africans. And the issue here is when you call foreign troops for help, you are not supposed to have them forever. You are supposed to, at some point, take the relay and continue and be on your own and be independent, autonomous about it. And everyone you speak with you speak to in Mali regrets that the training of African troops or Malian troops to begin with is just too poor. It's not satisfactory. Of course, you have among the foreign troops there, like the Germans, they have been training. Well, they have programs of training, but even those programs are being criticized because they are not appropriate, because they are too poor, because they are not really very relevant. So what you also have there is that you have the French have their own agenda in Mali. You don't feel that they're there to really help the Malian government. They are there with their own agenda of fighting against the jihad and the terrorists, and not really, coordinating themselves with the Malian government, and it's not the same agenda. They want to do what they want with the Tuareg, you know, those who have declared the Azawad government. They want to be autonomous, and the French obviously are backing them and helping them not to respect the Algiers peace accord, you know, which, for instance, has decided to have the government, the Mali government, take control over the whole territory. And the French are preventing them from doing that. And so they have their own agenda there. And I think one of the issues why Canada and some other countries feel like they are not being very efficient, and maybe there's a money issue too. I think there's another issue, is that they have a French agenda there, and maybe they don't want to be instrumental and being used and not being efficient.
Okay, let me bring in Mr. Day, because he's reacted to this somewhat. Is there a sense within the United Nations that the French are not necessarily following the UN peacekeeping line, or maybe their system?
No, I mean, there's the troops operate alongside each other, and I think what you see is MINUSMA actually supporting the French deployment with logistics assistance. I think the bigger question is the G5, the regional actors that are coming into the country to support peacekeeping. And one of the questions that the U.S. ambassador raised recently was, is the kind of work that MINUSMA is doing being seen as effective and appropriate in supporting those other actors? And I think the answer to that is maybe not entirely, but the real question is what would happen if MINUSMA withdrew that support? What would happen if MINUSMA was not supporting the French troops or the G5? And I think the answer there is no matter how far short MINUSMA may be falling, if you withdrew it, many of those capacities would not be able to continue on without their help, and you'd see a much higher risk to civilians and a much reduced capacity for the French and the G5 troops to respond. And I do think there's obviously national interests at play, and France has a long history in that country, but my sense within the UN is very much that the UN troops are there to support both the G5 and the Barkhane troops on the ground, and I don't actually see that or hear about that dynamic of not being aligned in interest, especially from an operational standpoint, actually.
Mr. Melly, How much concern is there about the void that's going to be left by the departure of these international peacekeeping troops? And to bring in another spanner, Russia's been expanding their military influence across the continent. Is there any concern that Russia will step in with their own training, and they've already provided arms to several countries, particularly with autocratic leaders? Is this a possibility in Mali?
Well, I think I would tend to play down the Russian issue. I think we must make a really clear differentiation between the situation in the Sahel and Mali in particular, and the situation in the Central African Republic, which is the most obvious case of Russian military engagement. There, although there's a UN peacekeeping force, the Central African Republic is not a country that's seen by Europe generally, or even France in particular, as a major strategic priority. And so the French, although they initially deployed back in 2013 an emergency intervention to forestall the risk of genocide, they always made it clear that their presence was going to be temporary. And the same, even more temporary, was the presence of the European Union force. And so when the Central African Republic government was looking for external allies who would supply it with arms, it saw Russia as a potential partner. Now, the situation in Mali and the Sahel is very, very different because Mali and its neighbors, Mauritania, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, they have a very close established security partnership with the West. And they have, for all the weaknesses in the Malian military, there is a long-standing pattern of collaboration with the French, and the European Union is running a training program for the Malian army based at Koulikoro outside Bamako. Mm-hmm. And so, as it were, the space for Russia to come in seems much less likely, and also Mali doesn't offer the natural resource attractions mm-hmm. that the CAR does. And I think another point that's worth making, going back to the comments that the other panelists have made, is the importance of remembering that Mali is a very complicated situation in which different players the aim is that they fulfill, as it were, different roles. So the role of the French in the far north particularly is to engage in the sort of proactive campaign against jihadist groups, which the UN force MINUSMA is not empowered to do under its mandate. And the same with the G5. The G5 force's role is to particularly fight jihadist groups and tackle narcotics smuggling gangs in the border areas that are a bit in the more settled, populated parts of the Sahel. Again, something that isn't really within the UN mandate. So there's a natural complementarity between MINUSMA providing support for these other players who are doing things which MINUSMA, the UN force, cannot itself do.
Okay. Ms. Biloa, I promised to get back to you about the peace accord. So very briefly, we have very little time left in the program. Can you tell us where we are with this peace accord and if it has achieved anything at all?
Okay. Well, the peace accord is something, that the single peace accord which is valid for now, even if, to begin with, some of the points were not really very peaceful, like, let's say problematic, like encouraging only those who took up weapons, and so they have like I would say the Tuareg movement, the Azawad autonomous groups. They had sort of an advantage over other populations in the area, in the northern area, and that's one of the problems rising right now, because they are a minority in the area they claim, and there are other communities who are not part of a conflict and who feel disenfranchised.
And with that, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Marie Roger Biloa with MRB Networks, Adam Day, United Nations University Centre, and Paul Melly from the Chatham House. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and thank you for watching. You can always see this program again anytime by visiting our website. That's on aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can always go to our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter, and our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Divya Gopalan, and the whole team here, it's goodbye for now.